Welcome back, everyone, to RoomPack's ResEdChat podcast. If you're new to the show, every episode we feature a variety of topics of interest to hired professionals who work in and with university housing, residence life, residential education, whatever you might call it. All are welcome here. So we have a very interesting topic today, talking about Stoicism and how it sort of relates to the residence life experience. I'd say maybe speaking a little bit more from kind of the staff perspective, but I'm sure student experience will kind of weave in here a little bit as well. But I think, yeah, I'm excited for this. It stuck out to me. We reached out as we always do every year, bringing on the blog cohort that has been writing. I've been kind of following along on the RoomPack blog. So this is just an opportunity to kind of get to know them a little bit better, a little bit of different format, and sort of add to that kind of thought leadership that they're adding to the field here. So we'll start as we always do, but our guest is a rare return guest to ResEdChat. So Sam, why don't you reintroduce yourself to everyone and give kind of a brief overview of your professional background, I guess the updates since you were last on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone. My name is Sam Ferrigno. I use she, her pronouns. In my current role, I'm working at George Mason University as their coordinator for RSDI, which stands for Residential Student Development Initiatives. All to say, I work a lot with our in house residential curriculum, as well as the student staff training process and the student staff selection process. Last we spoke, I think I was working at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where I was in the traditional community director role there. So the change kind of came from the work that I did at UMBC. I got to work a lot with the curriculum there, and I found it to be a really big area of passion for me. It was something that I really look forward to, going to those committee meetings every week, and taking student feedback and kind of crafting the most impactful residential experience I could. So I started looking for jobs that would kind of let me move more in that direction. And here I am at GMU. So yeah, I'm happy to be back.
Yeah. We recorded back in March of 2023, and yeah, I'm hoping as we're keeping the show going and more consistent, we'll have more opportunities of return guests and everything. 'Cause I think obviously there's obviously no shortage of great people out there to talk to about interesting stuff, but it's also like the folks who are like cool to talk to, and you have a very unique perspective. I remember just from that previous conversation, and that's kind of a through line to what we're talking about here, Stoicism. But before we get to that, because you have been as we're recording this is October of 2024. You've been writing on the RoomPack blog for this past calendar year. Could you just explain a little bit about your experience being a writer? And I guess obviously we're talking a bit about one of the things that you have written about, but if you just want to kind of give a tip of the hat to the other things that you've written about this year so far, yeah, just talk to us about your experience being a writer.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a strong theme to a lot of my posts, not all of them, but this is my sixth or seventh full year as a professional in an entry level position. So I think I see myself on the tail end of being at the entry level, having gone through a lot of different things at a couple different institutions, gained a lot of knowledge along the way. And hoping that a lot of what I write is helpful to newer entry level professionals. So, those hard lessons that I had to learn, hopefully instead they can read a blog post and learn those lessons a little bit faster than I did. So, I've written about using your Pro Devo funds. I think that was my most recent post that we just posted today, I think. I've written about AI. I think technology is also an area of interest for me, although there's a lot of writing out there about a lot of technology in higher education. So I kind of wanted to look at something new, especially because I find myself using AI. I see a lot of my coworkers using AI to do a lot of the work that we do, and kind of figuring out, at least within the higher education perspective, what is ethical. How do we use this in ways that is helpful and not harmful to ourselves, to the work that we do, to the students that we're working with? And then another post, I guess, that I'll highlight is I did a little 2 series curriculum post to kind of remind people that the curricular approach is something that can be really fun. I think a lot of times we get really in our heads, and curriculum again is a passion of mine. So of course I'm convincing everyone that it's the best thing in the world. But I think what I've seen at a lot of schools is the curricular approach can be seen as like extra work that we do. or just making things harder by changing everything from year to year. But looking at the long term goal of like, this is a fun and different way to engage with our students. They can learn some life skills, they can learn some lessons, again, learning them the easy way instead of the hard way, and have fun while doing that learning.
Yeah, and I think that that experience of being a writer and kind of like having to write about something in some like set frequency, like that idea of like, yeah, you're living and breathing the curricular approach on a day to day, and kind of like I don't know how maybe like the epiphany came to you, but that idea of like it feels like this has like become too dry or too like self serious or whatever. Like it's fun. It's sort of it should be something that feels enjoyable, and like, even I guess that idea of like all right, obviously you wrote about it in that way, but even just I'm sure people can make the acknowledgement of like okay, maybe like fun doesn't strike you the right way, but like this should not be like painstaking, like miserable, like whatever kind of work. It's like you should at least be taking sort of solace or pleasure in the idea of continuous improvement, like and trying to strive towards, like you're saying, like always trying to take the feedback and create a better student experience in the halls and everything. So yeah, so I think it is that the fun experience, I guess, of being a writer is like sometimes kind of forcing yourself to kind of stretch and look at something from a different perspective, and also like kind of coherently bring together concepts and connect dots and different things. So I think in that vein, I guess I'm curious. Part of sort of the genesis of how this topic came up, but like stoicism and relating it to residence life work. So we'll spend some time here. We'll start off though, if you could explain the concept of stoicism in case folks aren't familiar with it, and just kind of like the initial sort of way that you apply it to your work.
Yeah, sure. So Stoicism is an ancient philosophy, a school of philosophy. It originated in like ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and it really focuses on certain principles and virtues, and essentially, I mean, life is a lot more simple back then, but the Stoics believe that if you followed these four certain virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, that like everything will kind of just fall into place. You are doing what is right, doing what you believe is true, while also realizing that everything exists in moderation, which comes into that like temperance piece. And I think when they speak about temperance, it's a lot about like managing our own resources and emotions, right? The work that we do is can be very emotional, especially for people who work more directly with students who work on call. I do still serve in an on call rotation in my current role. So I think that's kind of what led me to kind of seek something out to outside of just our student development theory that we learn about in school. What are ways that I as a professional can better manage crisis, can better help manage students expectations. So I think that that's mostly what stoicism is about. They've got a lot of great like one liners, great quotes. So if you've ever heard memento mori, which means remember you will die. So it sounds kind of dark, but it's just a remembrance that we're supposed to live full whole lives, and also that we're not immortal. Don't do anything too crazy. And amor fati, which is love of fate. So looking at life as everything that happens in your life is a good thing, and or even if it isn't a good thing, having a positive perspective on what is happening in your life, because you don't really have any other choice. You what's going to happen is going to happen, and you can control so little of what's around you. Really, you can only control like what you've got going on in your own head. So you have no choice other than to accept and to love like the life that you are living.
Yeah, and I think like I said, we'll spend a little time here to kind of elaborate on this, but like it makes me think of this quote that I heard randomly on a podcast that I was listening to. I listen to a lot of podcasts myself as well, and like the idea of kind of something what you said that made me think of it was the quote being like, with things that happen to you, like it's all grist for the mill, like it's all fuel for the fire. It all sort of is like part of the journey. It's part of your story. And that idea of like trying to make the most of circumstance and understand like moderation and all those kind of things. It's like keep pressing onward, keep moving forward, and try to, you know, uh, take challenges and opportunities. Cause like, I would never, as much as I'm aware of like stoicism, like I would never describe it as like a inherently like optimistic like point of view, but it's at least just that idea of like perseverance and those sort of things, like the idea of like whatever adversity you encounter, like it's part of the journey, it's part of the story, it's part of what sort of like, can kind of shape you and all that. And I think yeah, like it being a very like equalizing kind of philosophy, that idea of like, because like, hey, we all kind of end up at the same place, so like let's try to make make the most of it. And I think it's certainly something that like when I've encountered like yeah, maybe those like kind of stray quotes or sort of anecdotes about stoicism, I've found it to be something that resonates with me. And I think that's also why I like this, yeah, kind of resonated with me as a topic to talk about for the podcast episode. So I appreciate it that you kind of brought this perspective into the space. And I think um if you can maybe, I guess, like talk a little bit more about um the idea of like how you're incorporating into your work. Like, do you see it sort of showing up as much as like how you're working with your colleagues, as you're working with your students and those sort of things? Like the idea that it kind of has like a pretty broad, like, 'cause I think you were mentioning kind of offhand like that, like, oh yeah, I'm on call and I'm dealing with a student, like I should try to keep some of these mantras and things in mind as I'm like doing that work.
If we had had this meeting, a couple months ago, I'm fairly new to my role. So if you had asked these questions while I was a community director, I think the answers would differ a little bit more because I worked a lot with students. Community directors are meeting with students, whether they're the RAs, they're students in crisis, students that have roommate conflicts every single day. Whereas in my current role, it's a lot less. I advise a student group. And I meet with students here and there to talk about our curriculum, what's going well, what's not going well, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there's three kind of areas where it's helped me a lot. And it's work-life balance, coaching students, and managing relationships with coworkers. So thinking about like work-life balance, I think I'm very pro work life balance. Again, I think Stoicism teaches us to like throw away what's not important. There's a lot of resources out there that use very like harsh language of like, toss the trash, whatever's not important to you as a person, like treat it brutally. If for me, for an example, right, like I'm a very anxious person. I reread emails like 10 times before I send them. Looking for every little typo, looking for like, oh, like is that what I said going to be misinterpreted? Like, is it 1,000% crystal clear? And that wastes a lot of time. So I'm getting better at it, but like that's one of those things. Like, is someone going to notice that there's a typo in my email? Maybe. Is it going to matter at the end of the day? Probably not. It's just an email. Like I would rather think about the life that I'm building with my partner, outside of work. So focusing less on those things that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because again, memento mori, remember you're going to die one day. Like you're not going to be on your deathbed thinking about that typo in that email. You're going to be thinking about all the wonderful things you did with your life. The second thing that I had said was students, working with students. Again, that's where more of the one-liners come in. I've had a lot of students in conflict with each other where they're doing and saying really harmful things. And being able to have kind of ask, like mix in restorative practices a little bit, and ask restorative questions, right? Are you living your values right now? Like what you said to that person, like, do you want that to be what you're remembered for? Would you say that, in another context, like, is this the kind of person that you want to become? And, a specific example might be like I've had students that want to go into the healthcare industry and they're threatening like physical harm on someone else. And like, where are our values? What values do you have that brought you to wanting to work in healthcare? And like how does that conflict with like what you're actually saying and doing right now? And I guess for maintaining relationships with coworkers, and this really hits harder at the CD level. I think most schools that I've worked at where there's more than a handful of CDs, the administration, the department has really tried to craft like a cohort model for community directors. This is a position that has a high turnover rate. So I think they're looking to decrease that turnover rate by creating more community amongst your coworkers. if you're investing in the people you work with, then you're going to want to invest in the position that you have. And that's a whole like separate topic on its own, of whether or not, that is the way to go about making these positions, giving them more longevity. But what it is also like I've seen a lot of coworkers where get into conflicts with each other, where like I find myself asking, like, what is the actual conflict? Like, what is going on? Of course, I ask myself that almost every day. What is going on? But the I think the quote that I'm trying to come to that really captures this the best is Seneca. He was one of the probably one of the most famous Stoics. He was an advisor to Emperor Nero. But he had said something along the lines of, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." It's one of my favorite quotes. But just speaking in modern times of like how much we get in our heads about like, oh my gosh, the way that person said that thing to me, like, do you think they dislike me? Like you're imagining, you don't know for sure whether someone likes you or dislikes you truly until they say it to your face. I do not like working with you. You can certainly, put together whatever like facts and experiences that you have, but truly like you don't know until they say it. So why create these stories in your head, right? It doesn't matter if my coworkers don't like me or not, especially if they're not willing to tell me what problems they have with me. Yeah, so it's just getting less in your head about everyday social interactions and seeing them for, what they are. And if you're concerned, like have that hard conversation with the coworker. Hey, I really didn't like the way you said this to me. Like, can you tell me more about why you said it this way, or what your intentions were when you said that?
Yeah, I think like it's just so because I think like all the things that you're talking about, like a lot of different, you know, uh, philosophies or whatever else would have you kind of end up in a similar place. But I think this being really refreshing in how like grounding it is. It's trying to kind of like simplify. It's like it feels very like serene because it's kind of that idea of like, yeah, we're in our own heads so much, like catastrophizing and all these different things and all that. It's like, but being much more present, being much more connected to like what is actually going on, like what's actually causing people to behave in such a way, like and uh, not hypothesizing based on like a crumb of evidence of like, oh, maybe you don't like me or something. It's like why would you think that? Because I think there's like I don't even know where it's originated from, but the idea of like Occam's razor or whatever, like the simplest solution is probably the right one, and the idea is like, oh, they're being such a jerk. Like usually they're not that way. Like what's going on? Like, do they hate me or like did I do something wrong or whatever? It's like they probably had like a bad day or like I don't know, they like woke up like didn't get good nights of sleep or something. But like uh so like that being like a simple thing versus like I don't think out of nowhere after knowing you for several years you did a thing that made them radically change their perception of you and now they're being like a awful jerk and whatever else and then you're gonna like linger on that all day and that'll sort of like I don't know, so it's like just like very grounding, very present, very calming. Like these are all like sort of verbs or feelings that I get, I guess, from just like some of the things that you're sharing. And I think it is very important because yeah, like residence life work and I kind of use this as sort of a setup for my next question, but like this work is so kind of inherently chaotic in the sense of like it is just a lot of variables, it's a lot of people that can be unpredictable or whatever else, so you need to be able to be nimble and flexible and sort of adaptable and all these sort of things. But I think none of us seems like kind of an oxymoron about the idea of like being very like grounded and sort of like sort of like still will allow you to sort of like go with the flow versus like I guess it's the idea of like getting, because if you're too in your head, you're maybe gonna like, anticipate or sort of like get ahead of yourself and kind of like be like jumpy or something like, but versus sort of the like stillness, the calmness, the sort of like, clear perspective. Um, you know, I don't know. Yeah. And I think it's interesting saying too, where like, I do feel like it's one of those philosophies where it's like, the quotes and the anecdote, like those like little mantras are as powerful as anything else. Where it's just like if you could like, kind of meditate on those like phrases and things, like they could just be so powerful. But like, I guess can you talk a little bit more about that? I guess just sort of because obviously there's going to be the interactions with students, there's going to be the interactions with your colleagues, and I appreciate kind of how you're sort of outlining some of the things there. But the idea of, I guess, what I'm sort of juxtaposing there, that like stoicism can get you to a place of sort of just being that much better equipped, like from sort of the like, stillness and adaptability for like the inherent sort of like unpredictable nature of just sort of like being in residence life. Like, is that something that you kind of feel as well?
A lot of Stoic philosophy, like if you read it at face value, you can say like, wait, that doesn't make sense. On 5 pages ago, you told me to do the opposite. But yeah, I think there's a lot to say about like what the Seneca quote about not existing in your head too much, but then there's something that seems directly in opposition of that, which is preparing for the storm, right? Preparing for the storm while things are calm. And again, at face value, you might think you're just telling me to overthink. You're telling me to think about all the things that could go wrong, and I don't like that. I don't want to do that. You just told me to do the opposite. But that is more about like actual preparation, like getting out of your head and being like, okay, well, I'm going to be on call in 5 days. Like, I need to go get groceries. That's an actionable thing I can do. So I don't have to stress about like what I'm going to be eating for the next week. Let me like talk to like my supervisor and see what's been going on. Let me read the duty logs and see what's been going on so I can see like what have been the busy days, what have been the common issues, what have been the buildings that have been having the most problems. So yeah, it definitely helps manage a lot of that chaos. But when I'm reading, because I have a book that I read every day, it's like a 1 page a day kind of thing. When you're reading, you really have to like go a little bit deeper than the surface, because otherwise, like there does seem to be a lot of contradictions in the book that I'm reading.
Yeah, I guess that's part of it, because and I guess that speaks a little bit too. That like it prepares you to be in a place of like adaptability, in so much as you're dealing with reality as it comes, or like just being very objective. Because I think the idea, from what you're saying, that example of like, all right, I'm going to be on duty, next week. That is a fact. Like, that is coming up. I know how far away that is. I should prepare, versus like getting in your head and being like, oh, I'm going to be on duty next week. It's going to be awful. It's going to be the worst week of my life. Everything's going to go wrong. Like, nothing I do, matters or can change that or whatever. And it's like, you don't know that. Like, no one can know that. What you do know is you are on duty next week. That does mean that your time is going to be a little bit more sort of like spoken for, whatever. You can objectively do things now to make that easier. Like, end of sentence, whatever. And so like that feels very much more grounded, very objective, and very, dealing with reality as it comes, versus like, yeah, getting in your head and all that. Um, and that allows you to sort of like, yeah, deal with things as they come to you. Like, deal with that duty call as it comes up, and you're sort of walking in, kind of like, all right, give me the facts. What's going on? Like, what are we dealing with here? Versus again, maybe being in your head and just being like, these dumb students and blah 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 blah, like whatever. And it's like you're just entering it. Like, you haven't even gotten any sort of insight as to like what's actually happening in the situation. Like, just kind of come to it and sort of like deal with sort of the inputs as they, arrive. But and I guess the other part of what I was kind of processing out loud as I was like presenting that question is the idea that like stoicism is important in this context, because it stands in such a stark contrast to the inherent sort of like unpredictability of residence life. So it's like, what's that much more important? Like, this is something that I think anybody could be like, oh, that sounds so great. Like, that would be really useful sort of like philosophy to have for life. And it's like, yeah. And if you work in res life, it's that much more important because like you just never really know what you're going to be dealing with any day, any given day in the halls and stuff. So like, I guess just that, I guess like if you want to sort of, however that hits you, I guess, of like stoicism is that much more important in residence life because of sort of the inherent, unpredictable nature of like the work.
Yeah, I think the word that comes to mind is resilience, right? So that's another component of Stoicism. And like another little one liner is like, it's okay to not have thoughts and opinions about things, especially negative things. Critics of Stoicism, I believe, would say that it's an unrealistic philosophy because it coaches you to like throw away your emotions, but like that's not true. I think Stoicism doesn't always consider emotions because just our society is very different from it was in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So I think that our relationship with emotions has become a lot more complex. But it's not about throwing away your emotions. It's about like maybe putting them aside for later, or like again temperance, like managing your own emotions, which student development theory, or 7 vectors of student development. We have to manage our emotions just like we expect our students to manage their emotions. So while critics might say again, like it's an emotionless philosophy, I would say it's just a simple way of living. You know, there are problems, there are solutions. If you have a problem and you don't have a solution, maybe find one, or like accept that there is no solution. So I think it's made me go about my work in a much simpler way. Whereas at my previous position, I was probably very vocal, like the first person to raise their hand and be like, I don't think we should be doing that. I do think it's important to advocate for our students and ourselves, but a lot of times I'm in a meeting and I go, you know, I think other people, I'll give other people a chance to speak because I do know that other people feel the same way as I do, or maybe I just, you know, I don't have an opinion of this, especially like during the election season. I don't have time to have an opinion on everything. I don't have the bandwidth to have an opinion on everything. So I'm just gonna be okay with not having an opinion on, you know, something that I probably can't change.
Yeah, I guess like it's because what I'm thinking of is like human beings are emotional animals. Like we'll have a lot of knee jerk things, and that's sort of like it feels very like you know I don't know, yeah, just like simple in that way of just sort of like whatever you feel it, you just direct it at whoever's like, in front of you kind of thing. And the idea where it might feel like, well, that's just sort of our inherent nature, right? But it's like, yes, but trying to come at it with like a stoic point of view, like it obviously it's just advocating for sort of simplicity in its sort of very nature. But the idea that like the solution there or how to sort of manage that is kind of simple, like one simple layer of sort of moderation of kind of just like it's not about not feeling, it's about like managing that feeling and maybe finding like the right outlets for it and um and understanding sort of that those feelings are there, but the idea that yeah, like you don't just have to like spurt out every thought that comes into your head, or sort of just if somebody like hits your foot while you're walking, you have to be like knee jerk emotion or whatever. It's like just sort of like let that be, where it could be like that's annoying, yeah, like I think all of us know that that's annoying and all that, but like what's the best uh use of that, or what, I don't know. So it does feel like it's sort of a simple layer, and that's sometimes maybe where it's sort of like confusing or frustrating for people, or it's just like no, it can't be that simple, or it can't be that easy, or it can't, like uh I don't know, yeah, like it's like our relationship with our emotions are so complex, and it's like yes, but I think just like a pretty thin firewall can sometimes go a pretty long way. We're not just living as sort of these like raw nerves of emotion that whatever. Yeah, I don't. I think that's uh, yeah, a lot of interesting kind of reflections and anecdotes, and some great quotes for sure. But as we're wrapping up, I mean, you did write on this topic for the Room Pack blog, so we'll obviously be directing folks to that. But I know you mentioned that book. I guess if you want to give kind of a shout out to that, or any other like resources, because I feel like this one obviously might be one of the better episodes for like folks to go do their homework on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, of like all the research that I've done online, there's one name that keeps coming up in modern Stoic philosophy, and that's Ryan Holiday. He wrote the book that I just mentioned. It's called The Daily Stoic. It's a one line a day, so it's like 366 pages, and you just read one page a day. And they have a regular version, which is what I have, but they also have a journal version. So if you don't want to write in a regular book, you can write in the journal version of the book, like a morning and evening reflection on like what that passage was for the day. He's got a podcast, he's got a website, he's got everything. And the reason it's kind of hard to come by like modern sources for a lot of this information is because like not all the this stuff was written down, or it's in a language that like three people on this earth can translate, you know, ancient Greek, or you know, Latin, which, you know, if you're a fan of Latin, I'm sure you could find some original texts and translate them yourselves. But you know, there's other than that, you know, the primary sources. So the main three, I guess, stars of Stoicism back in the day were Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, and again Seneca, who was an advisor to a Roman emperor. So anything you can find with their name attached to it, specifically Marcus Aurelius wrote Meditations, which was actually kind of like his personal reflections on his life, you know, all the personal lessons that he learned. And he was writing it to himself. It was never meant to be a book that was published, but it was helpful to a lot of people. So it's made its way out into the world. It's very short. I think I found YouTube videos where someone is narrating the whole thing, reading out the whole thing, and it's like 2 hours long. So I think that that's another. If you want a primary source, I would look up Marcus Aurelius's Meditations.
Awesome. Yeah, a lot of great stuff there. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, honestly, I'm kind of like, again, this has always been something that kind of resonates with me, that idea of like repeated, consistent sort of reminders and sort of like having those sort of like uh, moments to uh, really sit with like the quotes, the perspectives, all that. Like it's, I guess it's like, I mean, many sort of like very philosophical uh, kind of groupings or whatever, like kind of have that, or it's just like, oh, if you can just like remember these quotes or sort of like put them on your wall or something, like it's really, really powerful reminders and helping you to sort of constantly see things and have to think about them or whatever. But yes, it feels especially relevant here for Stoicism, and definitely feels like a very relevant and useful tool for all of our res lifers out there. And appreciate you thinking about this and sharing this, and for your service to the Room Packed community through being a writer over this past year. And we'll have ways to connect with you, your writing on this topic, and everything else that you've written in the show notes for the episode. So just really appreciate you, and appreciate your time hanging out for this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.